for freedom that nearly 250 years ago gave birth to a special place called America. It was a small cluster of colonies caught between a great ocean and a vast wilderness. It was home to an incredible people with a revolutionary idea that they could rule themselves, that they could chart their own destiny, and then together they could light up the entire world.
I'm Janet Morana, Executive Director of Priests for Life. Welcome to our program. Of course, I'm joined here by our National Director, Father Frank Pavone. And of course, everyone, Father, is talking about the Alito memo document leak.
Everyone, all the media outlets, Christian, secular, everybody.
We've been in this for over 30 years. And we've prayed and begged for the kind of media abortion is getting right now.
That's right.
Every place we go, I mean, you turn on the news right now, it's the lead story right off the bat. What's going on with the abortion battle? The other side is becoming totally unhinged. They're going to have a summer of rage. They're picketing the justices' houses. I mean, we have never had this kind of coverage. And I find, Father, like this past Sunday at church services, I had different people coming up to me, asking me all kinds of questions. So it's like it's on everyone's mind. But now is where we have to get our talking points down straight, because so many people don't understand what does this mean if Roe v. Wade is overturned.
And this is the document that was leaked, or confirmed as authentic, draft opinion by Justice Alito.
Right.
The opinion of the court, so obviously a majority opinion, completely reversing Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which had reaffirmed Roe.
So let's just explain to everybody, how did we get to this point? We had the Mississippi law, right, which is a gestational age act, right?
Right.
And that's what the abortion industry was fighting or taking to court, not to try to stop that law from coming into being. And it made its way all the way up through the court to the Supreme Court. So overturning Roe v. Wade was not the first premise by which this case came forward.
That's right. Initially, of course, the pro-abortion people always do this. They always try to block or challenge the enforcement of pro-life laws that get passed by the states. Now, here's an interesting point people should keep in mind. The court cannot wipe a law off the books. That's for the legislature to do. The court simply tells the state you can't enforce it because it's not consistent with the Constitution. The courts are always looking at two sets of laws: the statutes that the legislatures make, right, and constitutional law, constitutional provisions, whether they are the state constitution or the federal constitution. And so all the courts can say is, well, this law is or isn't consistent with the constitutional law, which has to prevail, is higher,
right,
and block the enforcement of it if they think it's inconsistent. So what the pro-aborts always do is they try to block these laws by going to the courts. In the case of the Mississippi law, first of all, let's talk about what it did. From 15 weeks measured gestationally from last menstrual period, 15 weeks into the pregnancy, the law says after that point you can't have an abortion.
You can't have an abortion, right.
So the courts have always said over these last 50 years, you can prohibit abortion in the last portion of the pregnancy, after viability, that is, as long as, but not before. So what's happening is Mississippi was challenging that. Say, we are going to protect the babies before viability. 15 weeks was, again, the line that the legislature drew. And again, keep in mind for further discussion, this business of line making, line drawing, policy making, that's a legislative kind of activity.
Not judicial.
Not judicial.
Right.
So they drew the line. Pro-abortion people challenged it in court. Now, the lawmakers whom we know, whom we honored, in Washington back in January, from Mississippi, they had their reasons for passing this law. They said, look, there's been a lot of changes in science, for example.
Right.
These babies can feel pain. These babies are I mean,
Well, and they operate on the unborn child.
right.
Also, I mean, like for example, I remember like one illness that they can really improve on is spina bifida.
Mhm.
When it's diagnosed at about 15 weeks, then they can schedule that unborn child for surgery where they can repair that hole. That the child will not end up with severe problems to walk or stand,
Mhm.
and it's become quite successful.
They do a lot of different surgeries on the unborn, but the lawmakers had reasons for protecting the baby, protecting the moms from the harmful effects of abortion.
Right. Because the second trimester abortion, Father, as we know, after 15 weeks is more complicated. It's a D&E procedure where the baby is literally pulled
It's
out,
dismemberment.
which is horrific and painful for the child, stopping its heart and everything else. But for the mother, it's more complicated. We know from listening to the doctors and the testimonies of women, there's a risk of a perforated uterus, damage to the cervix. The list goes on and on. And so many of those procedures, they have sometimes left parts of the baby inside the mother, and then
Yeah.
she ends up with a terrible infection that could be a cause of death even.
Well, with the dismemberment, you also have sharp bone fragments being pulled through the birth canal.
Right.
I mean, the risk of laceration, perforation is very, very real. The later these procedures are done, the more dangerous they become.
Right.
Okay. And Mississippi laid that out. The legislators, when you pass a law, the lawmaking body has findings, as they call them.
Right.
We had hearings, we brought in experts, we listened to them, we found A, B, C, D to be true, right? And
Well,
the lawmakers,
Right. The risk to the mother increases.
lawmakers are equipped to do that kind of fact finding and to make those kinds of determinations, even if there are medical uncertainties or differences of opinion in the medical community. The legislatures can still draw those lines. So you think about line drawing and policy making. That's the role of the legislature. So Mississippi did its work. Okay.
And the Supreme Court,
Well,
they granted them to
yeah, but
hear
let
the
me tell you
case.
what happened in the lower courts first. The lower court, the district court, remember the federal courts are district court, then appellate court, and then Supreme Court, right?
Right.
So the district court threw out the law. They again blocking its enforcement, right? They can't take it off the books. Why did they do that? Only based on one question. They didn't look at all this scientific evidence. They didn't listen to the question of the danger to the mother. They didn't listen to what the legislators were saying about how these late-term procedures ruin the reputation of the medical profession. None of these things. They said one question: is it before viability that this law is prohibiting abortion? Is it before viability? Well, the answer to that everybody agrees with. Of course, it is.
Yes.
15 weeks. They said, okay, that's all we need to hear. Can't enforce the law. Now, that was a lazy, narrow, ignorant way of doing this.
But then Mississippi took it to the next level, right?
Yeah, they challenged it. Unfortunately, the appellate court upheld the district court's decision. And then they appealed to the Supreme Court. And this is where a year ago, in fact, it was May 17th, okay, of 2021.
Right.
The Supreme Court announced that they would take the case. Now, this law had been passed in 2018.
Wow.
So
This is how long
it was percolate. It usually takes a couple of years to percolate up through the courts, but this one took an especially long time for the Supreme Court to decide one way or the other. In other words, they submit these cases, the justices meet, and they decide, yeah, we're going to take this case. No, we're not, right? This one remained in limbo for a long time. They met, like there was a couple of dozen times. They had the opportunity to say, we're going to take it. And they didn't say no, but they didn't say yes. So they were looking at this for a long time, okay? And then they finally announced on May the 17th of 2021
that
we're going to take this and we're going to answer one question. Now, you notice the way that they posed this question was not simply whether Mississippi's Gestational Age Act violates the Constitution. See, they could have framed it that way and narrowed the question down to just Mississippi's Gestational Age Act. But here's how they framed the question, and this from the beginning gave us a tremendous amount of confidence. They said, we're going to answer the question whether all pre-viability bans though. So bans on abortion prior to 24, 23, 22 weeks are unconstitutional on elective abortion. Elective abortion. Okay, so not questions of, life of the mother or anything like that. Just elective abortions. Whether all pre-viability bans on elective abortions are unconstitutional.
Right.
Now, the reason we were encouraged by that is that goes right to the core
Of
of Roe v. Wade and
Right.
Planned Parenthood versus Casey, because they established this viability standard, this boundary,
Right.
saying you can't protect babies in the womb before viability. It's like, why not? There's nothing in the Constitution about that. Here's the Constitution. It's not here, right?
Right.
It's not
Right.
very. It doesn't take very long to read this, by the way. So,
And of course, the unborn child's heart starts beating at about 28 days after conception. So that's, we all use a beating heart. Like if, Father, God forbid, you passed out in front of me right now, what's the first thing I do? I feel for your pulse.
right. So
that's a life or death decision. If you hear a pulse or beating heart, they're alive. Baby's alive at 28 days after conception.
So this was a very encouraging way that they put this, because then all pre-viability bans, it's hard to imagine the court saying yes to that question. In other words, oh yeah, they're all unconstitutional. Yeah, there's no way you can protect the baby before viability. In other words, the very way they framed the question suggested to us that they were going to say no as the answer.
Right.
Because they framed it in such a
Well,
broad
that means
way.
then all these heartbeat bills, that some of them are still being held up. They haven't been put in action
waiting
yet.
for
waiting
the
And
Dobbs
of course, we have the
decision.
Texas law that's in place, but not quite. It's like everyone's waiting with bated breath to see now.
There's a lot of laws then that hinge on that question.
Exactly.
And in the case of a no answer, then of course the question is, well, what does the Supreme Court do after that? So then, as you were saying, to continue with the history of this, after the Supreme Court accepted the case, Mississippi, of course, was in a position to present to the court their petition. Right. So first, there's the petition to the court to take the case.
Right.
If they say yes, then you send a petition to make your argument.
Right.
Okay. When Mississippi sent their petition to make their argument,
they
said, you know what? Yeah, because any abortion-related decision by the court is ultimately based on Roe.
Right.
Because Roe was, as we know, the 1973 case that changed abortion policy and made it unconstitutional to ban abortion, at least prior to viability. And like every decision since then, not just on whether to ban it or not, but every decision since then about even the slightest kinds of regulations on the procedure involve Roe v. Wade.
Right. And Father, viability standard is like a moving target anyway. If you go all the way back to Roe v. Wade, when they threw in that word viability at the very end, it wasn't in the oral arguments and it wasn't in the main part of the decision. They tossed it in at the end. Well, at the time of Roe, I think viability at that time was about 28 weeks.
That's right.
And most scientists and doctors will agree right now we're already down about 22 weeks.
Yeah.
It's
more like 22.
22.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk more about viability as we go through the arguments.
Right, but to have that as a standard,
it's not doesn't make sense as a standard.
It doesn't make sense because it keeps changing.
It doesn't make sense medically, much less constitutionally. It has nothing to do with the Constitution. And medically, it's a moving target, like you said. It depends which way you look at it. But we can get into that more.
Science keeps improving on this treatment of the unborn child anyway.
Yeah.
And I think viability, who knows, in the next few years might be down to 21 weeks, 20 weeks. It's going to keep going down as our ways of dealing with that unborn child improves,
So the Supreme Court took it up, announced it on May 17th, scheduled the oral arguments for December 1st.
Right.
Briefs in that period of time between announcing it and having the oral argument, the briefs were submitted. More briefs. Now, these briefs, of course, again, both the state of Mississippi and the abortion industry that was challenging the law, they have to submit their briefs. They go respond to one another. They do a supplementary brief in response to the other person's brief. Goes back and forth. There's various documents. Okay. We have these all available at SupremeCourtVictory.com, by the way.
And we submitted a brief too.
But then you have the friend of the court. We were friends of the court. You have these friends of the court briefs, which are interested parties around the country and around the world who have additional arguments that they want to make to the court. So the friends of the court submit these. We've done it in past Supreme Court decisions, of course, relating to abortion. And now we did it again. But there were more briefs submitted this time in the pro-life, making the pro-life arguments than in any other case in the Supreme Court history.
And I think, Father, what was important about our brief was that we brought in the voices of the women, the voices of experience, the people who bought the lie.
You mean the women who've had abortions?
Women who've had abortions, yes. Because so many of those women, if abortion wasn't legal, they would have never considered it. That legality gave permission. And I've been talking, so many of them have been contacting me now with this whole idea that Roe might be overturned. They're getting really upset now. It's like more healing is needed because they're saying things like, oh my goodness, if it wasn't for Roe v. Wade, I'd have my baby now.
Mm-hmm.
Because my mother would never have made me go have an abortion, or my boyfriend, or my husband. You know, they're really being shook to the core by this. And one of our regional coordinators out in Idaho, her name is Melissa Hempel, she had her abortion just a couple of months after Roe v. Wade.
Mm-hmm.
She was a 17-year-old senior in high school, and her mother made her. She didn't want to have the abortion. She begged her mother not to. You know, I'll place the baby for adoption. Please don't make me kill my baby. Her mother insisted on that abortion. And Melissa just told me the other day, if it wasn't for Roe v. Wade, I would have my baby right now.
Mm-hmm.
My baby would be 49 years old, almost 50 years old. And she said, look at this. A couple of months after Roe v. Wade, my mother used that as an out card to save the family embarrassment.
Yeah.
And she said, if it was illegal, my mother would never have suggested it. And I'd have a baby today.
That's right.
And she was never able then her next pregnancy, when she later married, she ended up with the miscarriage. And so she was never able to conceive a baby herself. She went on to adopt children. But it's another case where the only child she ever able to have was the one she aborted. And because of Roe v. Wade in her case.
Yeah.
So many of them, you know.
So the briefs were submitted, the oral arguments were held. When we heard the oral arguments, our confidence continued to rise because it really seemed as though we had a majority of the justices ready to uphold the Mississippi law.
Right. And you can tell that, Father, right, by the questions they ask, right?
Yeah, it's
during the arguments, right?
It's difficult to sometimes to read
Mm-hmm.
what direction they're going in. So yeah, one has to proceed with great caution. But it was pretty clear how they were thinking with these particular oral arguments. It was pretty clear that we had a good 6 justices ready to uphold the Mississippi law. It only takes 5 to win because you've got 9 justices. But it looked like we had 6. The further question about whether they would go so far as to reverse Roe v. Wade was in doubt. We thought we might maybe have 5 willing to reverse Roe v. Wade. The question mark was Justice Roberts, because in the oral arguments, he was making that distinction. He was saying, well, 15 weeks, that certainly is a reasonable limit. And he says, but why did you go ahead and ask us to, reverse Roe v. Wade? Because sometimes the court wants to take, they don't want to take the trouble to answer a question beyond the scope of what's at issue. But although Mississippi made it at issue, they said, we want you to reverse Roe v. Wade. But people were unsure, where are they going to be willing to do that? Or will they just say, we're going to uphold the Mississippi law and also let Roe v. Wade stay? Now, if they try to say that, which now that we've seen this draft from Alito, which we'll talk about in more detail, this shows that there is a majority willing to get rid of Roe. But if you were to say, let's uphold the Mississippi law, but also uphold Roe, you can't do that without very, very, very significantly changing Roe, because at the core of Roe is this viability line.
Right.
So it's like, why are you going to, what part of Roe then are you going to continue to uphold? You're going to continue to say that there's some kind of constitutional right to an abortion? Where? I mean, one of the key arguments that we and all the other friends of the court and Mississippi were making to the court is that it's not in the Constitution. Of course, we make this argument in every abortion case. Where are you getting this so-called right to abortion? Where are you getting it? It's not, again, here it is. Here's the Constitution.
It's not there.
It's not here.
I know.
You know.
It's not.
So again, that like the question before about, is this ban pre-viability? The question of whether this ban is pre-viability, the question of whether abortion is in the text of the Constitution. These are indisputable points. Okay,
Right.
there's no question. Okay, so then this leaks out.
Well,
Now-
and just stop there for a minute, Father. A document leaking out from inside the Supreme
Unheard
Court
of. Unheard
is
of.
totally unheard of since the Supreme Court was
Even that there would be
established.
one sentence
Right.
from a draft opinion leaking.
That's unheard
out.
of.
That was unheard of too.
And what people should be upset right now, and I've been saying this, Father, I don't care if you're pro-abortion or pro-life. Every American should be upset about the leak
Well,
because
they
it
should.
undermines the ability of the justices and their staff
Yeah.
to work in this atmosphere of confidentiality.
Yes.
It's been broken.
You
And
know,
until they find out how the leak happened and where it came from, everyone's got to feel a little bit uneasy right now working with each other because your trust has been broken.
you can't break the confidentiality of the
No.
court. There's not that many people who would have had access to this.
Well, that's the thing.
There's
You
there's
have
the
nine
nine justices,
justices,
and each of them have four clerks.
So
Four-
9 times 4, 36 plus 9.
45 people.
45.
Most likely, and Senator Cruz brought this up recently in a hearing. Most likely, we're talking about a pool of 12 people. That is the 4 law clerks of each of the 3 liberal justices.
And the justices themselves.
The left wing.
I would say 15. I did the 3 liberal
Mhm.
justices too.
Now, having said all this, I must say that the overwhelming emotion, however, was joy and jubilation at actually reading what was leaked.
Right.
You can be upset at the fact that it was leaked, that it shouldn't have been done. The leaker needs to be punished. We need to maintain the
Right.
security of the court. But my goodness, they released a victory here for us, a big victory. Because what this opinion does, it not only upholds the Mississippi law, it reverses and it obliterates from the judicial landscape Roe v. Wade and also Planned Parenthood versus Casey.
So exactly, Father, because I know you've read this in detail.
Yeah.
Exactly. Give me an example. How does it do that?
Okay. Well, let's walk through it. He starts, of course, by saying abortion is not in the Constitution, and he reviews what we already just discussed: what Mississippi did, why they did it, how it went up through the courts, what the lower courts decided, and that it was accepted by the Supreme Court. So, I mean, every decision is going to do that. They're going to review, first of all, the history. Then let's go. We're going to go, and we're going to have a part 2 of this discussion, of course. But going through the steps that he makes, the points that he makes one by one. The law in Mississippi itself, then, and its history. Again, we discussed it already. He goes through. Then he asks the following main question. He has a few main questions in the opinion. But does the Constitution confer a right to an abortion? That's the first question he looks at in great detail. Does this document, this is founding law in the United States, together with the Declaration of Independence, right? These are the 2 founding documents. Does it confer a right to an abortion? Because that was the claim of Roe v. Wade in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. That's the claim of the abortion supporters ever since.
They're saying that there is a right to it.
So Justice
Where?
Alito says where and how does it do that? Now, he makes an interesting point. Planned Parenthood versus Casey, we have to understand Casey to understand this whole decision. Casey came in 1992. We hadn't met yet. All right, I was a parish priest, however, and I was very involved in the pro-life movement. And we thought at that time that decision was going to reverse Roe v. Wade. It looked like we might be close to reversing Roe v. Wade. That was about Pennsylvania having passed some regulations on abortion, not even prohibitions. And the court was going to decide whether they were okay. It involved parental involvement and some other requirements, record keeping, and the court actually upheld 4 out of 5 of these regulations that Pennsylvania had passed. But the underlying question, like we said before, any case relating to abortion is resting on Roe v. Wade. Okay.
Right.
So the court could take the opportunity, if it wants, to reverse Roe with any of these cases. And it looks like they almost did in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But they ended up not doing that. Roe was left intact. But they did change it quite a bit. They changed it quite a bit because apparently, if you read Casey carefully, a good number of the justices didn't really agree that Roe v. Wade was well argued or even constitutionally based. So they actually didn't answer this question. This is strange, right? Because they upheld Roe, but they didn't address the question, does the Constitution confer a right to an abortion? They actually didn't answer that question. They skipped over it. So you might say, well, then if they skipped over it, how did they, uphold Roe? Stare decisis. They upheld Roe by this doctrine of stare decisis, which means, it's two Latin words, which basically mean we're going to stick with what we decided before.
Right. It's like precedent.
Precedent.
Right.
Precedent means a case on the same issue you're talking about now that was decided earlier.
We're going to let it stay.
And let it stay. It's a let it stay argument, which is really not much of an argument. I mean, there's a purpose for precedent. There's a purpose for stare decisis. You know where you're going. In other words, it's a consistent development of policy, of jurisprudence, as it's called, the approach the court takes to an issue. Predictability, it brings predictability because other courts have to deal with the same issue, right, in different disputes that arise. And so you want some kind of predictable course of development of the law. And so if you're always changing, you don't have that, right? But this deals with a very, very fundamental matter of life and death. So you got to get it right. So, but Casey skipped over the get it right part and says, well, we've had this for a long time and we don't think it's time to jettison it, but they changed it a lot though.
But Father, you have to think in 1992, you and I at that point, we were involved at the parish level. It was right before you got involved with Priests for Life. And we continued our work together. But think back to 1992. Abortion was rampant in the country. Some of the highest statistics.
Yes, we had reached the peak. Yeah, 1.6 million a year.
So I think also the justices were saying, well, women have come to rely on abortion. You know what I mean? Like it was just happening so frequently. I think it was over 4,000 babies at that point a day was the figure. I mean, it was just a reliance on abortion so much. The number of abortion mills in the country was, I think it was about 900. They, at that point, were outnumbering more of the pregnancy centers. We were in a very different atmosphere in 1992. And I think that's probably why they did the stare decisis, like let it alone, because of the atmosphere in the country.
There weren't, right now, the abortion clinics have really, really gone down.
Oh, yeah.
And
they outnumber, the
pregnancy centers
4-1.
Yeah.
There's for every 4 pregnancy centers, there's only 1 abortion clinic.
Now, at that time, it was practically the reverse of that.
Yes.
At the time of Casey.
Yeah.
So you didn't, things were very different from many different angles.
Right.
So they said, you know what, we're going to let this stay for now.
Right.
Even though, again, the opinion changed it radically. They changed things about Roe. They rejected some of the argumentations. There was almost like they were embarrassed by the argumentation of Roe because they didn't reaffirm the arguments. Like Roe has a very, very, we're going to get into this as we delve into this in further episodes. Roe had a very, very unprofessional history analysis. Casey didn't even bother to repeat it.
Right.
Okay. They had very bad constitutional reason. Casey didn't endorse it. And then they did legislative work. Remember we said before, the reason I wanted to emphasize that line drawing is the job of the legislature. Well, Roe drew a lot of lines as far as what the state could do about abortion at different stages of pregnancy. Again, where did all these lines come from? Nowhere in the Constitution. Right. So the court wasn't judging the applicability of a law vis-a-vis the Constitution. They were legislating. So they created this framework. And it's like when Casey came along, they actually did away with that. Yeah. They did away with the Roe divided the pregnancy into the 3 trimesters.
Right.
And we'll get into this more. The state could do certain things in the first, second, third trimester. Casey didn't go along with that. They changed it. They brought in a new standard, which ended up being just as unconstitutional and confusing. This new opinion gets rid of that standard too. But the fact that they made so many changes in Roe goes to show that Roe was already crumbling.
Yeah.
Okay, and the court acknowledged that by what it did in Casey. So Alito, again, in the first part of this whole thing, he addresses that question: does the Constitution establish a right to abortion? And in short, make a long story short, and we'll talk more next time.
No.
He says no.
Exactly.
He says no. It does not establish.
Well, you know, Father, thank you for this first delving into this, and
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone appreciates it. We're going to have a subsequent part 2 discussion.
Yeah.
And for our viewers, you just need to go to SupremeCourtVictory.com. The latest information and Father's analysis and everything else is always there. So just go to SupremeCourtVictory.com. Until next time, this is Janet Morena, Executive Director, Priests for Life, and Father Frank Pavone, our National Director. Let's continue to pray for our victory. Thank you.
I think we have Richard Lee, we have Jim Garlow, and we have Father Frank Pavone. Someplace there in the audience, so I appreciate you. I appreciate you being